Tonight, we wander into a custom so small and quiet that it might have slipped between the cracks of memory, if not for the stubbornness of old stories. Bread under the bed. Not for eating. Not for storage. But for something else. Something that sat in the air between superstition and faith, between the smell of fresh loaves and the whisper of the dark. For centuries, in villages from the Scottish Highlands to the valleys of Italy, people placed bread beneath where they slept. It was a gesture both ordinary and mysterious, a loaf baked not just for the body, but for the night itself. So let's dim the light, hear the fire's soft breath, and step into the warm, strange heart of this forgotten ritual. The loaf beneath the dreams. In the village of Rannoch, a place where roofs slouched under the weight of moss and windows squinted against the wind, it was not unusual to find a loaf of bread beneath a bed. Not a crumb-dusted remnant of last night's supper, but a whole, uncut loaf, round, golden, and smelling faintly of yeast and hearth smoke. It would rest there quietly, its crust softening in the night air, until morning came. Then it would be replaced with another, as though the bread were a guest needing fresh linens each day. The custom was old, older than the carved stones at the edge of the green. No one could quite remember when it began, though the elders swore their grandparents had done the same. It was said to guard against a dozen misfortunes, bad dreams, roving spirits, toothache, even the wasting sickness that left children pale and thin. Elen, the miller's daughter, had never questioned it much. Her mother kept a small shelf of bread under each family bed, each wrapped in linen as if it were a swaddled child. But when Elen's best friend, Thomas, returned from the city and laughed at the idea, calling it village nonsense, something inside her bristled. She decided she would ask old Marta about it. The widow lived on the edge of the wood and was known for her habit of answering questions with more questions. But if anyone knew the truth of bread's nightly vigil, it would be her. That night, before she left, Elen bent down and checked beneath her bed. The loaf lay there like a small, sleeping moon, waiting. The woman at the edge of the wood. The path to old Marta's cottage wound between hedgerows that had grown unruly with summer. Nettles brushed against Elen's skirts, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and elderflowers. By the time she reached the clearing, the cottage seemed almost a part of the forest, its roof shagged with moss, its walls furred with ivy. Marta was sitting outside on a low stool, stripping the leaves from a bundle of mugwort. Her hands moved with the calm, deliberate rhythm of someone who had done the same motion for decades. She didn't look up when Elen arrived. "You've come for the bread," Marta said, her voice like the creak of a well-used door. Elen hesitated. "I came to ask why we keep it under our beds. Tomas says it's just an old superstition." Marta's eyes, pale as birch bark, flicked up at her. "And you think superstition and protection are two different things?" The question hung between them. Elen opened her mouth to answer, but Marta stood, brushing the herbs into a basket. "Come," she said. "If I tell you, you must listen with both ears, and not laugh, for laughter makes a story hide itself." Inside, the cottage smelled of wood smoke, rosemary, and something faintly sweet, like apples drying on a high shelf. Marta poured them each a cup of chicory tea and began. "The bread," she said, "is not for you. Not entirely. It's for what walks in the space between waking and sleep. Bread is a promise. It tells them you are fed, and therefore safe to leave alone. An empty belly draws company you do not want." Elen leaned forward. "What company?" But Marta only sipped her tea, as if the answer would have to wait for nightfall. The company Marta meant. That night, Elen lay awake long after the hearth coals dimmed to a dull red. Tomas slept soundly beside her, his breathing slow and even, but she kept turning over Marta's words in her mind. The cottage was still, save for the faint crackle of settling wood. Yet there was a kind of pressure in the darkness, as though the night itself were listening. Her gaze drifted to the small loaf tucked beneath the bed, just as her mother had always done, and her grandmother before her. It sat on a folded scrap of linen, the crust golden brown, the smell faint but comforting. Then came a sound. Not the scamper of mice, nor the rustle of wind. This was softer, like fingertips brushing the floorboards. Elen held her breath. The sound moved, deliberate, pausing now and then, as though sniffing the air. She felt a prickle along the base of her skull. The loaf shifted. Only slightly, but enough for her to see the linen crumple at its edges. A shadow, not cast by any firelight, slipped back into the darkness beneath the bed. Her first impulse was to wake Tomas, but something deeper, older, kept her still. Marta had said not to laugh, not to treat it lightly. So Elen closed her eyes and whispered, without knowing why, "Be full and be gone." The room eased, as if some invisible weight had lifted. And in the faintest thread of thought, just before sleep claimed her, she could have sworn she heard a reply. Kindness remembered. Marta's truth. By morning, Elen was certain she hadn't imagined it. The bread under the bed had been nudged, not by rats, not by restless feet, but by something that knew what it was doing. Tomas noticed nothing, of course. He rose before dawn to tend the sheep and kissed her cheek absent-mindedly on his way out, leaving her with the smell of his wool cloak and the cold patch he left behind. She wrapped her shawl tighter and made her way to Marta's cottage. The path wound through frost-stiff grass, and crows followed her overhead as if they knew a secret. Marta was already outside, hanging strips of dried yarrow and mint in neat bundles along her porch beam. "You've come early," Marta said without turning. "Something moved your loaf." Elen stopped in her tracks. "How?" Marta finally faced her, her expression unreadable. "They rarely make themselves known to new keepers. You must have a softness about you." She gestured for Elen to sit on the low stool by the door. "We've always had them here. Call them breadkeepers, call them crumb folk, call them what you like. They don't belong to the church, or to any king. They belong to the hearth." Elen frowned. "And if you don't give them bread?" Marta's voice thinned. "Then they take other things. Warmth from your bones. Breath from your lungs. Or worse, they'll invite hungrier things in." Elen's stomach tightened. "And the words I said, 'Be full and be gone'?" Marta's eyes softened with approval. "Old words. You remembered them without knowing. That means you can keep them happy." She pressed a fresh, smaller loaf into Elen's hands. "This one's sweeter. For when you need a favor." The favor loaf. That night, Elen baked as Marta had instructed, no salt, a spoonful of honey, and just enough flour so the dough kept its softness. The kitchen filled with a warmth that clung to her skin, sweeter than any loaf she had ever made for herself. Tomas was late coming home, his boots thick with mud from chasing a stray ewe. He barely noticed the bread cooling on the table. "Save me a slice for morning," he muttered before disappearing into the washroom. Elen waited until the house was quiet. She cupped the small loaf in her hands and whispered, feeling foolish but oddly reverent, "Be full and be kind." The words tasted warm in her mouth. She slid the loaf under the bed and blew out the lamp. It was the kind of stillness you could almost hear. Then, a soft rustle, like bare feet on linen. A tiny sigh, almost satisfied. Elen felt it before she saw it. The air beside her warmed, and the faint scent of something, not bread, not honey, but green, like spring earth, brushed past her nose. The next morning, Tomas sat at the table, grinning in a way she hadn't seen for months. "You'll never believe it," he said. "The old juice milk came in heavy last night. Enough to sell early at market." Elen hid her smile. When she checked under the bed, the loaf was gone. Not a crumb. The whispered market. Elen couldn't stop thinking about the missing loaf. Not stolen, vanished. And the used sudden milk, it was too neat to be a coincidence. The next baking day, she shaped another small round, this time sprinkling a few crushed fennel seeds into the dough. It gave off a sharper, wilder scent. She whispered again before sliding it under the bed, this time with more daring. "Bring me something unexpected." She woke before dawn to the sound of something tapping against the doorframe. At first she thought it was the wind. But when she opened the door, there on the threshold sat a basket, not hers, not anyone she knew, with 6 bright apples, their skins shining as if they'd been polished. Apples in early spring, when no orchard in the valley had fruit yet. At market that day, she mentioned the apples to Marta in a low voice. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "You're not the first," Marta said. "And you won't be the last. But be careful what you ask. The bread-keepers don't trade like we do. Their kind likes balance. Favors for favors." Elen felt a strange thrill at that, as if the rules of her small, known life had suddenly opened to reveal a path no one had told her about. That night she baked again. This time she whispered, "Show me who you are." And when she woke, someone, or something, had left a single long, white feather on her pillow. The feather and the footsteps. The feather was unlike any Elen had seen before. It wasn't from a goose, duck, or any barn fowl. Its barbs shimmered faintly, as though dusted with frost, and when she brushed it against her palm it gave off a subtle warmth instead of chill. She carried it in her apron pocket all day, feeling its weight, or rather, its presence. Even while kneading dough for the morning customers, her hand drifted toward it, like a child reaching for a charm. That night, she placed the loaf under the bed again, this time with the feather nestled inside the crust, half-baked and so it would not burn. She whispered, "Come take it yourself." Sometime past midnight the sound woke her. Not the creak of her own floorboards, but the softer tread of bare feet on packed earth. The air in the room shifted, cooler at first, then warmer, as if a fire had been lit somewhere very far away but was drawing closer. Elen kept her eyes closed, heart pounding. She heard the scrape of wood on wood, the bed frame shifting slightly, and then, a breath. Not quite human, not quite animal, slow and deliberate. Her courage faltered, but curiosity was stronger. She opened her eyes a sliver. 2 shapes crouched by the bed, small, hunched, their outlines blurred as though they were clothed in mist. One reached a hand, thin and long-fingered, beneath the bed and withdrew the loaf. The other turned its head toward her, and though its face was hidden, she felt the unmistakable weight of being seen. In a voice like the rustle of wheat in wind it said, "Ask better." Then they were gone. The room smelled faintly of earth and warm bread. Ask better. The words clung to her mind all morning like the smell of baking rye, familiar, but persistent. Ask better. Elen had thought her request was clear, "Come take it yourself." Yet, when she thought of their strange faces, or the lack of faces, she realized there was nothing clear about it at all. She decided to try again. The next evening, after the bakery shutters were latched and the last coals in the oven had settled to a deep, steady glow, Elen sat at the flour-dusted counter. Instead of kneading, she began to write, something she hadn't done since school. On a scrap of rough paper she wrote, "I want to know who you are. I want to know why you take the bread. I want to know what you give in return." She folded the paper and placed it inside a hollowed loaf, sealing it with a crust patch as neat as any baker's repair. She let the bread cool, then set it under the bed just as the last candle was blown out. The night was quieter than most, no crickets, no distant dogs. Elen lay awake, half listening for those bare, soft footsteps. When they came quickly. The same scrape of wood, the same shifting air. But this time, there was a pause. A weight settled at the end of her bed, not crushing, just enough to make the frame dip. A hand, thin and long-fingered, rested on her ankle. It wasn't cold, but it was impossibly light, as though made of smoke and intention. "We take," said the same rustling voice. "Because you leave it. We give because you ask. But you must know how to ask." "What do I ask for?" Elen whispered before she could stop herself. There was no answer. The hand lifted, the bread was gone, and the room was her own again. Only in the morning did she notice. The folded paper was back on the counter, but the writing had changed. It now read, "Ask for the thing you cannot bake." The thing she could not bake. Elen turned the note over in her hands so many times that the edges began to curl. The thing she could not bake? She could bake almost anything: breads light as breath, rolls soft enough to tear with 2 fingers, crusts that cracked like fine porcelain. She could coax yeast to life in winter, and make stubborn dough rise in damp summers. But the note was not about skill. It was about want. That afternoon, she walked the village, letting her eyes wander over what other hands made: the potter's cups, the weaver's shawls, the blacksmith's latches. She imagined herself trying to replicate each one, and realized with quiet certainty she could learn them, if she wished. It wasn't about craft. It was about something no oven could give her. When she returned to the bakery, she tried an experiment. She baked a small loaf, and, instead of tucking herbs or honey into the dough, she pressed inside a tiny carving of her father's, one he made the summer before he died. A sleeping bird, no bigger than a walnut. She placed it under the bed. That night, she woke again to the footsteps. This time they were slower, hesitant. The bread vanished, as always. But the air remained heavy, as if something lingered. When she awoke, there was no loaf, no carving. In its place, on the counter, sat a jar. Clear glass sealed with wax, filled with something that shimmered like morning dew but did not spill when she tipped it. She did not open it. Not yet. Instead, she placed the jar in the window, where the first rays of sun touched it. The light bent through it in strange ways, scattering shapes across the flowery counter, shapes that moved slowly, like they had somewhere to go. Elen realized then, she might have just been given something she could not make, could not trade for, and could not explain. And now she had to decide what to do with it. The jar in the window. By mid-morning, the jar had drawn the attention of half the street. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because people passing by slowed, then stopped, frowning at the way the sunlight inside seemed to move. Children pressed their noses to the glass of the bakery door, pointing. One boy swore he saw a fish dart through the shimmer. An old woman said it was a feather caught in honey light. Someone else claimed it was a flame that didn't burn. Elen kept her hands on the counter, refusing to touch it. She was not ready. The trouble was, the jar felt alive. It did not hum like a beehive or pulse like a living heart, but it had a kind of listening stillness, like the air before a thunderstorm. By the third day, she could no longer pretend she wasn't curious. She locked the bakery door, took the jar in her hands, and carried it to the small table where she mixed herbs for tea. The wax seal peeled away in a single slow curl. The lid lifted without resistance. At once, the air in the room deepened. Not darker, deeper, as though space itself had tilted slightly. A soft scent rose from the jar, rain-soaked soil, rosemary, something faintly sweet like apple skins. And then, quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that feels aware. From inside, something unfolded, invisible but heavy, like breath you could hold in your palms. It didn't spill so much as step into the room. Elen's heart knocked once, hard. It whispered, not in words but in the shape of them. like the memory of someone speaking long ago. And the first thing she understood was this: the jar was not a gift. It was a question. The first answer. The question was not in a language she knew, yet she understood it all the same. It was something like, "What will you offer?" Her first instinct was to answer aloud, but the silence in the room seemed to press gently against her throat, telling her that words were too thin for this. So she stood there, one hand still on the jar, and thought. She had no great treasures. She was no healer with rare tonics, no scholar with secrets from the past. She could bake bread, yes, but that was hardly the sort of offering one made to something that arrived in a jar of impossible light. And yet, wasn't bread what had always been under the bed, beside the bed, near the bed, guarding the sleepers of her village for generations? Wasn't bread the one constant thing, humble but enduring, in every story she'd ever heard about keeping harm away? She went to the oven and pulled out the last loaf from that morning's batch. Still warm, its crust was golden and crackled faintly when she touched it. She tore it in half, the scent of wheat and yeast filling the little room, and placed one half beside the jar. The silence changed. Not louder, not softer, but it leaned closer, like someone smelling a dish they recognize. She felt the air shift across her skin, the way one feels when a cat walks silently past their ankles. Then, faint as the slip of a shadow, the light in the jar dimmed. Not gone, just less insistent, as though it had settled, accepted, for now, her answer. Elen realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly. The jar was quiet again. The half-loaf sat untouched. But she knew, that something had just agreed to stay. Bread dreams. That night, Elen dreamed of bread. Not just loaves rising in her oven, but fields of wheat bending in a wind she couldn't feel. She walked barefoot between the rows, the ground warm and soft, the golden stalks swaying taller than her head. Somewhere beyond the field, a voice hummed, not words, not even a tune she could place, but a sound like yeast bubbling in a warm bowl. Every so often, a stalk would bend toward her, and the head of wheat would speak. Not with lips, wheat has no lips, but with a rustle that went straight into her mind. She couldn't remember the exact phrases when she woke, but she knew they had been answers. To what questions, she wasn't sure. She opened her eyes before dawn. The jar still sat on the table, faintly glowing, the half-loaf beside it. But the bread was no longer whole. A single bite had been taken, not large, but deliberate. The torn edge looked nothing like teeth marks she'd ever seen. Instead of fear, she felt a strange peace. The presence had not taken more than offered. It had not stolen or spoiled. It had tasted. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Customers came to her bakery, praising the bread as usual, though some lingered oddly over the scent as if catching something unfamiliar in it, something they couldn't name. That night, she placed another half-loaf by the jar. And again, she dreamed. This time, she stood in her own kitchen, but the shelves were lined with loaves of every shape and color, rye as dark as soil, barley pale as sunlight, flatbreads folded into neat stacks. From each loaf rose a faint, curling vapor that shimmered in the dim air. And in the shimmering, faces formed, smiling, nodding, watching her. She woke with her hands smelling of flour, though she hadn't touched any that evening. Whispers in the crust. Within a week, Elen's bread was no longer just bread. People began to linger in her shop after buying a loaf, breaking off small pieces and eating them right there, as though they couldn't bear to wait until they were home. They chewed slowly, eyes distant, and sometimes would mutter things that made no sense, half-forgotten childhood memories, names of people long dead, or strange phrases in languages Elen didn't know. At first, she thought they were simply savoring the taste. But she began to notice the pattern. The ones who spoke the most strangely were the ones who, unknowingly, had been sleeping with her bread under their beds. They never admitted to it outright. It was as if they themselves weren't aware, but the way they carried the loaves carefully, like charms rather than food, told her enough. Word spread, as it always does in small villages, though no one could explain what was happening. One evening, the innkeeper came to her door long after she'd shut the bakery for the night. He was pale, his eyes watery, his loaf clutched under his arm. "I dreamed of my wife," he whispered. "She was wearing the apron she died in. She told me where to find the key I lost years ago. When I woke, it was under my pillow." Elen said nothing, only stepped aside to let him in. He wasn't the first to tell her such a thing. When she placed the half-loaf under the jar that night, she didn't just wait for sleep, she invited it. She lay down with the faint scent of baking all around her, and the hum began before her eyes closed. The voices in her dreams were louder now. And somewhere in that chorus, she thought she heard her mother. The oven's secret. The next morning, Elen went to the bakery earlier than ever before. The sun was barely a smear of pale gold on the horizon, and the air carried that sharp bite only winter mornings can manage. She lit the oven, as she always did, but today she did not prepare the dough. Instead, she sat in front of the fire, knees drawn up, and stared into the flames. Her mother had taught her that bread was alive, that the yeast was not just a chemical thing, but a living spirit that could be coaxed, fed, and spoken to. Elen had always taken it as a poet's exaggeration, the kind of thing a mother tells a child to make chores more magical. But the voices had been growing clearer each night. She pulled the jar from the shelf, the one she'd been using for the half-loaf ritual, and turned it slowly in her hands. It was just a jar, glass worn smooth from years of use, yet the moment her palm pressed against it, the faintest warmth pulsed through her skin. And then, without thinking, she spoke. "I can hear you," she said into the quiet of the bakery. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then, deep in the oven's belly, the heat shifted, not hotter, not cooler, just present. A whisper, low and almost crackling like dough in a crust, answered. "We remember you." Elen's breath caught. The voice didn't sound like one voice. It was layered, hundreds of tones at once, as though every loaf she'd ever baked was speaking together. "You keep us safe beneath your beds," it said. "You let us guard your dreams. We do not forget." Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the strange weight of being addressed by something so old, so impossible. The voice spoke again, softer now, almost fond. "But there is more we can show you, if you are willing to sleep deeper." The deeper sleep. That night, Elen didn't just put the bread under her bed. She lay down with the half-loaf clutched to her chest, the coarse crust pressing against her nightdress, and closed her eyes as if she were cradling a heartbeat. Sleep didn't come gently. It dragged her. One moment she was staring at the timbered ceiling, the next she was falling, slow, steady, as though lowered into a warm and endless dark. When her feet touched the ground, she was no longer in her room. She stood in a field lit only by the glow of countless ovens, each one floating a few feet off the ground, their doors swinging open to reveal loaves rising and cracking in the heat. The smell was overwhelming, sweet, earthy, alive. A figure approached, not entirely human. Its skin was like dough before baking, soft, pale, dusted with flour. Its hair was wheat, long and golden, swaying though there was no wind. "You came," it said, voiced the same layered murmur she had heard in the bakery. "I don't know how," Elen admitted, glancing around. "Is this where bread lives?" The figure laughed softly. "Bread doesn't live here. Memory does. Every loaf kept safe under a bed, every crumb spared from waste, every piece shared in hunger, they all come here, to be part of the great keeping." Elen felt a warmth in her chest, a deep recognition. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Bread remembers who you are." The figure gestured for her to follow, leading her through the glowing ovens. "Tonight you will see why your village began this ritual. And you will see what comes when bread is forgotten." Somewhere in the darkness beyond the ovens, a shadow shifted. It was not warm. And it was not friendly. The hunger without a name. The air beyond the last oven was colder, sharp in a way that felt like it could scrape skin from bone. Elen hesitated, but the wheat-haired figure kept walking, its bare feet silent on the dark soil. The glow of the ovens dimmed until they were nothing more than far-off embers. Ahead, something moved in the shadows. At first, she thought it was smoke. Then she saw the way it curled and uncurled in shapes that were almost hands, almost mouths. "This," the figure said quietly, "is what waits when bread is not kept close." Elen's breath came short. "What is it?" The figure did not look away from the shadow. "We do not name it. To name it is to call it. But it is hunger, not the hunger of an empty belly, but the kind that hollows out the heart. It comes for the lonely, the forgotten, and for villages that forget to honor the keeping." The shadow shifted closer. Its movement had no sound, but Elen felt her ears pop, as if the air had been pulled from around her. The ovens in the distance flickered. "When there is no bread under the bed," the figure continued, "the keeping is broken. And the hunger can pass into the world. It does not eat food. It eats the part of you that can still feel full." Elen's stomach tightened, not from fear alone, but from the strange ache of recognizing the thing in front of her. She had felt it, sometimes, in the quietest nights when her father stayed late at the tavern and the wind rattled the shutters. The figure turned to her. "You have the loaf. That is why you can stand here without being taken. But you must decide, will you keep the bread for yourself, or will you take on the work of keeping for others?" The shadow's formless edge brushed the ground like black water spilling. Elen took a step back, clutching the loaf so tightly that crumbs pressed into her palms. And somewhere, deep in the dark, something whispered her name. The loaf between worlds. Elen's pulse thudded in her ears. The whisper from the shadow had her voice, but stretched thin, like it had been pulled through a keyhole. She swallowed. "If I keep the bread, what happens?" The wheat-haired figure's eyes were strange, bright, but with no reflection of the ovens behind them. "You'll be safe. For a while. But the hunger will come again. And next time, it may not knock. It may slip in." "And if I take on the keeping?" Elen asked. "Then you will sleep lightly, and never without bread close to hand. You will place loaves under the beds of those who have none. You will feed more than bellies." The shadow shifted, and Elen's legs felt cold, as though the warmth of her body was leaking into the earth. She thought of her father, who forgot to eat when the work was bad. She thought of the tanner's wife, who always looked tired, and the boy who swept the tavern floor, whose bones showed in his wrists. Her arms tightened around the loaf. "Then I'll keep for others." The figure nodded once, as though it had already known. It reached into the dark space between them and impossibly drew from the shadow a second loaf, identical to the one in her hands, yet somehow heavier, as though it carried more than flour. "This is your first keeping loaf," it said. "Tonight you place it where the hunger waits closest. You will feel the cold under that bed. Lay the bread there, and you will hear it retreat." Elen took the second loaf, her fingers brushing the figures. A strange warmth passed through her, not heat, but the solid, comforting weight of being needed. The shadow hissed, not in anger, but like rain suddenly hitting fire, and pulled back toward the far darkness. And then, just like that, she was back in her own kitchen, the smell of warm bread filling the air, 2 loaves in her arms, and the moonlight slanting pale and watchful through the shutters. The first night's rounds. The village slept under a sky that looked dusted with salt. Only the frost on the ground caught the moonlight, shining like spilled sugar. Elen moved between the cottages in silence, a loaf tucked under each arm, her breath blooming into pale clouds that vanished before they touched the eaves. She had never walked the village at this hour before. By day, she knew every corner, who lived where, which shutters rattled in the wind, which gate hinges moaned when you passed. But now, each house seemed unfamiliar, reshaped by darkness. Roofs hunched like tired shoulders. Doors slumbered like closed mouths. The first place she stopped was the tanner's house. She didn't need to knock, the figure's words had been true. She felt the cold pooling under the frame, spilling like a thin draught from beneath the bed inside. It was not the ordinary chill of stone floors. It had a weight to it, as if the air itself had been starved. Elen crouched and slid the heavier loaf through the crack beneath the door. The cold pulled back almost instantly, folding into itself, vanishing without protest. She thought she heard the tanner's wife shift in her sleep, a deep breath escaping, like someone who had been holding it for too long. She moved on. The tavern boy's bed was harder to reach. His room sat above the common room, with its floorboards that remembered every footstep. Elen climbed the side stairs, pausing as a drunkard muttered in his sleep below, then pushed the second loaf into place against the thin door. It was the same there, the strange, unnatural cold retreating, and the quiet sigh of someone easing deeper into sleep. By the time she returned to her own house, her arms were empty, but her heart felt oddly full, like a baker's basket after a morning's work, knowing the bread was gone but not lost. She set her hands on the cooling oven bricks, the scent of wheat still in her hair, and thought, this is only the beginning. Whispers beyond the fields. At dawn, Elen expected to rest. She had been up through the coldest hours, walking barefoot on frost-hardened earth so as not to wake the dogs, leaving warmth where cold had crept in. But as the bread oven's embers cooled, there was a knock. Not the brisk, morning kind that carried the smell of trade or gossip. This was slow, deliberate, each rap spaced as though the hand on the wood wasn't quite sure if it wanted to be there. On the threshold stood a stranger with hair the color of clay dust and a cloak damp from the road. His face had the weary openness of someone who'd slept more under hedges than roofs. In his hands, he carried a single round loaf, hardened with age. They said, he began, voice low, that there is a baker here who knows the old way. Who can make bread that keeps things out at night? Elen didn't invite him in immediately. They told you that? They told me enough. The sickness. He paused, searching for the right word. The hunger, whatever it is, it's in my village now. Children waking with eyes wide, mouths too dry, saying they dreamed of eating and woke empty. We put bread under the beds, like my grandmother said, but it doesn't work. Not anymore. She studied the loaf he held. It was cracked and gray, baked without care, perhaps without belief. Bread needed more than flour and fire to live. Elen stepped aside. Come in. Tell me everything. And if you're telling the truth, I'll come with you. The man's shoulders sank, as if he'd been holding himself upright through sheer will. He crossed into her kitchen, and the scent of road dust and cold air followed. That was how she learned the hunger was no longer a local thing. It was traveling, crossing fields and rivers like a shadow with feet. And it was learning. The last loaf. By the time Elen reached the stranger's village, the air itself seemed starved. Windows were shuttered though the sun was high, and door frames were marked with the soot smears of desperate charms. The people spoke in quick, hushed voices, glancing often at the beds in their homes as though they might suddenly speak back. She moved from house to house, leaving small loaves under the frames, touching the foreheads of children with fingers dusted in rye. But the hunger here was stronger than in her own valley. It pressed against the walls at night, sighing like the tide, testing the strength of wood and will. On the final night, she baked one loaf alone. It was not for under the bed. She kneaded it slowly, speaking names into the dough, names of the hungry and the sleepless, the newborns and the elders. She worked until her wrists ached, until her voice was hoarse, until the bread was more prayer than food. When it came from the oven, the crust was the color of deep earth. She carried it to the village square, set it on the cold ground, and stepped back. The wind shifted. Shadows lengthened. And then something, thin, pale, and smelling faintly of dust, leaned close to the bread. No one saw its face, but every person who stood watching felt a pressure ease inside their chest, as if something had unclenched. The loaf split in two without being touched. The hunger, whatever it truly was, took its half and was gone. When the villagers looked again, Elen was still standing there, her hands empty, the night utterly still. She stayed only until the first light. Then she walked back toward her valley, carrying nothing but a small pouch of flour and the memory of a voice she'd never heard, thanking her in the dark. From that day on, no one in that valley forgot to keep bread beneath the bed. Not for fear of what might come, but to honor the night it left.